Welcome to Tactical Talk. This is Zain. The extremist ideologies have become part and parcel of modern security dynamics, as well as of asymmetrical warfare. To discuss the genesis of these extremist ideologies and how to counter them, we have with us today an eminent speaker on counter-extremism, Mr. Raza Rumi. Welcome to our show, Mr. Raza Rumi. This is Zain Khan. It's a pleasure to have you on Tactical Talk.
Well, thank you very much, Zain, for asking me to talk to you.
Mr. Raza Rumi, what does extremism mean in its philosophical sense, and where do you see it deep-rooted in our society?
Yeah, so extremism in its philosophical sense, or it has variety of definitions, and there is no one definition where people agree. But overall, in sort of lay terms, it refers to a particular worldview or a mindset or the kind of ability to view the world and events from an inflexible, rigid lens, which either adheres to some ideology or some idea, and so it could be religious, as is the case in Pakistan. It could be ideological. So, you have some versions of extremism. For example, in the Soviet Union, you had another extremist communist ideology. You have that in China as well, where you must have seen that Muslims in the Xinjiang province have been disallowed to fast. So, these play out in various forms. But if we were to narrow it down, it would mean that, it's a kind of a worldview that you want to impose on others. And you can use any means to do that. Sometimes you use coercion, sometimes you use persuasion. But by and large, it refers to holding a rigid idea, a dogma, a belief system, which needs to be imposed on others. In our context, Pakistan's context, because that's what you want me to talk about, it would largely refer to the kind of ideological narratives that exist in our society, promoted by the clerics of various shades and sects and hues, who think that Pakistan and Pakistanis and its citizens should act and behave in a particular manner. And if they don't behave in that manner, they ought to face some certain consequences. Either they ought to be excluded, or they ought to be, named and shamed. And in certain extreme cases, they can also be killed. So the two major forms of extremism that we see are, for example, the violence against the Ahmadiyya community, which was excommunicated from Islam, quote unquote, in 1974 by Pakistan's parliament, and later on the legislation was developed, which further excluded them. And now many mullahs says that because they are apostates and they have kind of violated their view of religion, they are wajibul qatl, or fit to be murdered. So that's one example. And then you have these other violent groups, the Taliban, etc., who also think that a particular brand of ideology is required to be followed and adhered by everybody. So that's what I generally mean by extremism.
What can we learn about extremism from the Nazi and communist Marxist history in the context of the Second World War and during the Cold War, Mr. Rumi?
I've partly answered that, but just to elaborate that, the Nazis in Germany also thought that racial superiority and the superiority of a particular German race in this case was the pure ideal version for the country, and all other divergent or less pure people had to be either reformed or eliminated. So we saw, large-scale killings and kind of torture and imprisonment of the Jewish population, of gypsies, of gay people, and so those were the horrific sides of an extremist ideology. I've mentioned the idea of communism earlier, and I think part of it has to do with it's linked to the idea of nationalism in Europe. Largely extremism and this Puritan worldview emanated from the way nationalism or nationalist discourses were evolved. And in the case, I mean, in the current day, I mean, our neighbor India, where you have a Hindu nationalist government in power, and you often see their ministers or their senior people or religious leaders making similar kind of statements. So, for example, they banned beef in certain states, and they said, okay, those who want to eat beef should leave the country and go to Pakistan, so that there is no room for any dissenting or alternative way of life. So I think that's a very very tragic development, which means, and it is linked to the idea of India or the nationalism that ought to be sort of followed there. I'm not saying that Mr. Modi per se is now promoting this, although he's linked to all these groups, and his followers and chelas say similar things, but definitely this is a very, very kind of disturbing trend.
Mr. Rumi, what is the connection between extremist ideals, radical madrasas, and oil-rich financiers?
I think there are three major kind of factors at work. Well, first has to do with the fact that the religious seminaries always existed in wherever Muslims were, and in fact, Muslims, let us not forget that the idea of madrasa in the medieval times was actually a very celebrated idea, because that's where a lot of knowledge was produced, a lot of Greek translations were done, and that was the time when Europe was in dark ages. And Muslim thinkers like Averroes or Ibn Rushd were translating the Greek ancient texts and transmitting them to the world. And later on, some of those ideas, particularly of separating religion and state and church, became the basis for Reformation in Europe. But over time, this whole the concept of a seminary became fossilized as the Muslim societies also became static and stagnant. So by the 12th or the 13th centuries, all jurisprudence work had been done, and the Muslim empire, the Arab Empire and its various extension and affiliates and branches had sort of, huge amounts of territory, and they were the power of that time. But the clerics that served that power said, okay, we have interpreted what is our faith, and now it is all final. And that led to this stagnant thinking. And in the subcontinent, um, Indian subcontinent, some of these ideas were also promoted by the state, particularly in the Mughal times under Aurangzeb, where the famous Fatawa Alamgiri, or the lectures or discourses of Alamgir, if you were to literally translate that, are still being taught. These were largely developed in the late 17th and early 18th century, and they're still in use in many seminaries across Pakistan and India, and in some cases another, even in Bangladesh. And the problem is that these ideas are important to understand religion, and of course Muslims are very attached to their faith, and they want to know more, and they want to know the various interpretations and what is Sharia and how should they conduct their lives, their communities, etc. But but over time it has not been updated. It has not been brought in line with modern imperatives, and that is where the disconnect occurs. Uh, in the 20th century, particularly in the latter part of it, with the rise of, Gulf states discovering oil and making lots of money, and the whole concept of petrodollars, has also been at work, and in particular, the Saudi monarchy and its allied groups have invested a lot of money and effort into promoting their particular Wahhabi Salafi brand of Islam, and which is not the dominant kind of sect or worldview within Muslims. It has always been a kind of a minority, but but because the Saudi monarchy has always been seeking legitimacy, not just at home but also abroad, as the guardian protector of holy sites of Muslims, so they've been aggressively promoting it. And also, this process started in the 70s, and our bad luck is that, because of our geostrategic position, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and we became allies with the United States to push the Soviets out of Afghanistan. So we helped, the US with a lot of Saudi assistance and US money to create more and more seminaries of this kind to train jihadists who would go and fight the evil atheist communist regime and drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. Now that succeeded, but it had a heavy cost on Pakistani society because the subcontinent Muslims largely belong to the more tolerant or plural kind of merge with local traditions, folk traditions, or what can be loosely called as folk Islam. And so there was this imposition of an ideology through these vast networks of seminaries. And remember that these seminaries, other than jihadists, which were used for jihad purposes, also produce religious teachers for a lot of other seminaries and schools. And they also produce the prayer leaders, the imams of mosques. So not just in Pakistan or but they've been exported abroad in the UK as well. And they bring these ideas then, and these ideas are often, a particular interpretation. They're not always, they're not divine. They are man-made jurisprudential ideas, and that is, and some of those ideas preach or justify violence against infidels, against non-Muslims and apostates. Because you see, this concept of apostasy emerged when the Muslim Empire in the 8th, ninth, 10th, 11th centuries went into different parts of the world, conquered them or established their kingdoms over there, and then a lot of people converted, and then they could not. So apostasy was used as a more of an anti-state, to punish anti-state elements, and not as people who were questioning faith or trying to explore it or trying to understand it. So, that political power has gotten mixed. And now that political power is the major driver of extremism, because most of these groups and violent extremists think that they can use faith or sectarian understanding to gain political power.
Mr. Rumi, what exactly do the extremist movements desire by manifesting their extremist ideals through the use of indiscriminate violence?
Right. So I think I've already answered this question of yours. So I'll I'd like to speak about a little about how this has further found traction within Pakistan. So alongside the spread of seminaries, Pakistani state, because of domestic politics, General Ziaul Haq had ousted Bhutto in the 77 coup, and Bhutto's whole, Islamic socialism or secular idea. And Bhutto had himself given that up, by the last years of his rule, and he had moved towards a version of Islamization. So Ziaul Haq aggressively used that because he also wanted a domestic justification to rule Pakistan, and he did very successfully for 11 years. Successfully in the sense that he held power without any major threat or opposition. And he used religion or faith as the justification, because he said, well, I'm bringing Sharia, I'm bringing Islam to the land of the pure, and therefore I have a kind of a divine right to rule. And in that phase, the Pakistani textbooks were also altered from late 70s, way throughout the 80s, more and more, tweaking and ideological indoctrination was done through these textbooks, which kind of, trained the young minds in a greater acceptance of extremism and jihadism. And alongside this process was also, as I mentioned earlier, the link between the seminaries and prayer leaders or imams. The imams were kind of given state patronage. And a lot of mosques also became the funnels or process through which the zakat money, which was also imposed, the law was enacted in 1980, where the state was taking out zakat mandatorily from people's private bank accounts. And these imams or mosque leaders also became the channels through which this was distributed. So there was political patronage, there was financial patronage, and there was this whole ideological doctrine of the climate, and we still are actually stuck into that. And that is why, unfortunately, it's a long-term battle that we have to do.
Mr. Rumi, there is a need for a global counter-narrative against extremism. Do you think it has already been developed, or are the Islamic intellectuals still planning to counter this problem?
Right. So you're saying what kind of a global counter-narrative, or well, I think, of course, there's a lot of talk on countering violent extremism, CVE, as it's known currently in its new sort of branding. But surely that counter-narrative has to challenge some of these fossilized ideas that exist in many Muslim countries, where the interpretations of Sharia or jurisprudence are very sacrosanct, very sacred. And there have been voices against that. Allama Iqbal, the national poet of Pakistan, a great poet of, India as well, and he's quoted in Iran, he's quoted in Indonesia, had talked about that in the 1930s. He said, we need to reinterpret and open the jurisprudence and update them, because they were developed during 10th and 11th centuries, and now they needed kind of updating, and they were not divine, because the divine text is the Holy Quran, according to the beliefs of Muslims. Other than that, everything is open to rationalization, of application of reason, and the Quran itself asks Muslims or followers of Allah to apply reason and logic to the questions of the day. And so I think the first task is, of course, that that kind of jurisprudential work needs to be advanced within Muslim societies. It is already happening in certain cases. Like we have Dr. Tahir Qadri in Pakistan, who is a moderate voice. His ideas are also finding traction in other parts of the world. You have other academics and scholars, but these works are scattered, and these works are not at one place. And to bring them together, to communicate these ideas, in Pakistan's particular case, the state would have to play a role. Similarly, in other countries where these ideas are getting traction, the states have to kind of focus on what these ideas say. And the other thing also, that in many Muslim countries, in the Middle East or even parts of Pakistan, there are issues of governance also. There are issues of state failures. So why is Islamic State capturing Iraq and parts of Syria? Because the state has collapsed. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq, this state was decimated. U.S. tried to build a kind of an artificial state, which also is now cracking in parts. And wherever there's a void, these groups come in and become the state. So Islamic State collects taxes. It gives a semblance of order, of stability to local population, and gets some traction and adherence. So I think both the political governance and kind of counter-narrative work challenging the extremist ideologies, because these are man-made, needs to be done.
What is the role of media and clergy in regards to both promoting and countering extreme ideals?
Media, this is a very important question. Media has emerged as a major source of kind of spreading extremist ideas. There was a very interesting BBC report some years ago, just a couple of years ago, where a journalist looked at what was shown on television in Iraq and in other parts, and where sectarian discourses were going on, where polarization was taking place. And if you look at that, that influences the mind of people, whether they're Shias or Sunnis. If you go to Iran, they have a whole narrative which is anti-Saudi, anti-Sunni extremist, ideas. And if you go to the Saudi and the Gulf countries or the Middle Eastern countries, they have the other idea. And in Pakistan, where I come from, of course, media is a major source of spreading extremist ideas, because it again dates back to the late 1970s, because when the state was engineering this whole using jihad as a tool for Afghanistan policy, it also gave huge space to extremist writers, columnists, speakers into the body politic. So I think some of that has to be challenged. It is being challenged already. So I'm quite optimistic, but it needs to be aggressively challenged, and particularly those media outlets or writers that inflame passions, that incite violence, ought to be dealt according to the law. I mean, you can't really give people space or leeway just because they are religious clerics. Because at the end of the day, if their actions are leading to harmful consequences, they must be dealt with as other inciters of violence.
Mr. Raza Rumi, last question. How will madrasa reforms assist with countering extremism, and do you see the reforms being any effective?
This is a $1 million question. How, of course, madrasa reforms are required, not just in Pakistan, they're required in Indonesia, they're required in, other parts of the world, and particularly with this Gulf money and clerics and universities that are coming in. Now, see, the Islamic University in Islamabad, it's a big campus, and it has some very good teachers. And in part, it has trained a lot of Pakistanis in, subjects. But, there's a very strong ideological undercurrent there as well. So for a long time, if I have friends there who studied, and they told me that Shias were not allowed to study there. Now, 1/3 or 1/4 of Pakistani Muslims are Shiite. So how can you exclude them from an Islamic university? We have to recognize that Islam is a pluralistic tradition. Of course, we all believe in one God and one prophet, and all the commandments and all the rituals and rites. But then there are cultures: the Central Asian Muslim, the Southeast Asian Muslim, the South Asian Muslim, the African Muslim. They all have their own cultural identity, different languages, different worship, times and practices, and tweaked habits. And I think Islam was always accommodative of that. It had a very strong free thinking tradition as well. It has narrowed down, with this onslaught of Wahhabi Islam. So in take the case of Pakistan, the government announced after the ghastly attacks in Peshawar last year that madrasa reform was on top of its agenda. Sadly, that has slipped again, and it is not being pursued. And I think that is a very vital reform. The first thing is to register. More than half of the madrasas are not registered. At least they should be registered. How many students? Who's the teacher? What's the curricula? Where do they exist? How are they financed, etc. So that's the first step. And then second is to look at the curricula. And of course, it has to be done in with the consent of clerics or madrasa networks, like Wafakul Madaris, it's a federal council for madrasa management, where you have to sit down and see, some of this curricula may actually not be good for the society, because the society in Pakistan, you have Shias and Sunnis and Hanafis and Ahmadis and Wahhabis, and so you have to be accommodative of all of that. So that's the first step. And then the second step is that the foreign teachers and foreign money and what do they do and how they link to the militant networks needs to be identified and de-linked as well. So it is going to be a long-term process. See, it is a 30 to 40-year-old process. It's not going to go over in 6 months or even a year. If we start today, it's a process that will take 5 to 10 years at the least to get somewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Raza Rumi, for taking out time for our show. I'm sure our audience have learned something new today.
Well, thank you very much, Zain, for asking me to talk to you. And of course, I follow your work, and I'm very happy to, engage in your useful sort of dialogue.
This was Mr. Raza Rumi, a political commentator and also significant journalist in Pakistan and internationally. He discussed questions revolving around the topic of counter-extremism. Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, this is Zain Khan. Take care and goodbye.